Tonight, we dive headfirst into the strange, occasionally absurd world of medieval European punishments, a time when justice was equal parts creativity, improvisation, and whatever popped into the head of a man wearing a questionable hat. Back then, legal precedent was less established case law, and more whatever made the crowd clap. So before we wander into the cobbled streets of history, you might want to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy these strange journeys. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. There's something oddly satisfying about knowing a story about medieval sewage can be enjoyed at breakfast in Tokyo and midnight in Madrid. Now, lights down, maybe add a quiet fan in the background for atmosphere, and brace yourself, because if you think your worst hangover story is bad, try imagining it ending with you trapped inside a wooden beer barrel while your neighbors pelt you with turnips. Welcome to the drunkard's cloak, the one medieval garment that destroyed dignity and posture in one go. Here's the system: you got drunk. Not charmingly tipsy and singing folk songs, but catastrophically intoxicated, the kind of drunk where you think arm. Wrestling the church bell is a great idea. Perhaps you serenaded the fountain. Maybe you woke up face down in a pigsty. Either way, the town council decided you needed correction. Correction came as a large wooden barrel with 3 holes, 1 for your head, 2 for your arms. Once shoved inside, you were no longer a citizen but a walking keg of regret. Then came the parade. Picture yourself waddling along cobbled lanes, the wood squeaking, and a faint aroma drifting from the barrel's last cunt, and possibly wine, possibly salted fish. Either way, the effect was memorable. Townsfolk followed, jeering, tossing vegetable scraps. Gossip flourished. Children learned that grown-ups can be disasters. You learned oak is remarkably heavy. In some German towns, they used the barrel pillory for petty thieves and serial gossipers too. Think of it as a medieval sandwich board declaring I made bad choices, but heavier, smellier, and far less washable, and believe it or not, this was seen as merciful. No broken bones, no branding, no dunking in rivers, just a humiliating shuffle through town. In the hierarchy of medieval justice, that was practically a wellness retreat. Still, judging by the hollow stare of its victims, the night of drinking had never felt less worth it. If the drunkard's cloak was the walk of shame, the cucking stool was the sit. Ins, splash. This was aimed mostly at scolds, a term for women accused of nagging, gossiping, or generally being inconvenient to male authority. Offenses ranged from starting riots to simply pointing out that the baker's bread was stale. The contraption was simple: a sturdy chair or rough bench attached to a beam or suspended above water. The accused was strapped in, paraded through town so the crowd could warm up their heckles, then dunked repeatedly into a river, pond, or whatever water supply was handy. Some victims got clean water, others got the town's open sewer. This being the pre-antibiotic age, you weren't just humiliated, you were introduced to medieval dysentery. The dunking wasn't meant to kill. Officially, it was to cool one's temper, medieval code for publicly break your spirit. Fraudsters and cheats also met the chair, usually to the town's delight. If money was involved, someone would inevitably shout, "Hope you can swim in debt," from the bank. Some towns made it theatrical, rolling the chair around beforehand to build suspense. Or they'd swing the beam so only half your body got soaked, while the crowd debated whether to finish the job. Fun fact: cuck in cucking stool comes from the old word for defecate, which, considering the cleanliness of medieval rivers, was tragically accurate. You'd emerge soaked, shivering, and possibly reconsidering your approach to small town politics. If medieval life had a talent show, the shame flute was the buzzed-off button. Officially called the flute of shame, it was punishment for bad musicians, noise makers, or anyone who had been too loud for the council's liking. The device resembled an oversized metal recorder, except it didn't make music. Imagine a trombone welded to a neck brace, an unholy fusion of metal and mockery. It locked around your neck, shackling your hands as if you were playing it, and off you went into the streets to perform. Movement was awkward. The thing was heavy enough to bruise, and the crowd, they were merciless, This wasn't only for failed musicians, drunkards, loud gossips, or post-curfew shouters could also find themselves in the one-man band of humiliation. The punishment relied entirely on embarrassment. Children pointed, drunks requested songs that didn't exist, and dogs offered silent judgment. If you tried to speak, the sound echoed inside the tube, making you even more ridiculous. And no, you couldn't redeem yourself by playing something good. It was designed not to work. Depending on your crime, the sentence could last hours. When it was over, you went home with aching arms, a sore neck, and the lifetime label of that guy with the fake flute. Moral of the story: never play your lute badly, and for heaven's sake, avoid bagpipes. Lastly, we have the Branks bridle, the medieval mute button. Another punishment for scolds, a translation. Women who annoyed men in power. It was also called the scold's bridle. Think of it as a helmet designed by someone who hated joy. The device was a metal cage fitting over the entire head, but the piece de resistance was inside a spiked plate resting on your tongue. Speaking meant stabbing yourself, so you learned silence very quickly. From a distance, you looked like an unfortunate extra from the strangest parade imaginable. The bridle's real purpose wasn't justice, it was control. A woman wearing it couldn't argue, gossip, or even hum without pain. Some bridles even had bells attached, so everyone could hear you coming. Humiliation on surround sound. You'd be paraded through the streets, unable to defend yourself, while passers-by enjoyed the spectacle. Once removed, your mouth was sore, your dignity gone, and the message clear: stay quiet. Medieval punishments were rarely about fairness. They were public theater morality plays acted out on human bodies. And in a world without social media, this was how reputations were destroyed, lessons taught, and crowds entertained. So next time you think your society's rules are a bit much, remember, at least you're not waddling in a barrel, dangling over sewage, fake, playing a giant flute, or wearing a spiked head cage just because someone didn't like your tone. Up close, you could tell some creative soul had poured an unreasonable amount of energy into inventing a device whose sole mission was to shut you up in the most embarrassing way possible. The unlucky wearer would be paraded down the main street so everyone could admire the latest innovation in seasonal humiliation. The purpose wasn't subtle. It was to turn you from neighbor into local curiosity in record time. No longer a person with thoughts about the price of bread, you became a walking joke. Occasionally, the bridle came accessorized. Bells that jingled, tiny horns, or even whimsical little animals welded on. These weren't for decoration so much as to amplify your shame, announcing your arrival long before you reached the market square. They turned the punishment into a kind of village performance. Because nothing says medieval justice quite like making sure half the town stops mid-task to watch Martha from down the lane drool onto her own shoes. Did it work? In the short term, yes. You couldn't speak, shout, or mutter a word. In the long term, not really. The device often inspired more gossip than it prevented. Did you see her in the bridle yesterday? Quickly became a juicier topic than whatever sparked the dispute in the first place. And taking it off didn't restore your dignity. In a small town, word traveled at the speed of candlelight, and for months afterward, you were the person who wore that thing, the moral. In medieval Europe, silence wasn't just a virtue. It could save you from wearing history's most uncomfortable conversation starter. If you were accused of wrongdoing, but the evidence was thin, you didn't get a lawyer or a jury. You got an ordeal. The reasoning was elegantly simple. If you were innocent, God would protect you. If guilty, well, enjoy your last loaf of rye. One classic was the boiling water ordeal. Your hand went into a cauldron of scalding water to retrieve a stone from the bottom. Afterward, it was bandaged and left for 3 days. If the wound looked miraculously healed, you were declared innocent. If it was a festering mess, which shockingly it often was, you were guilty. Another favorite was the red, hot iron test. You carried a glowing metal bar for several steps, then your burns were inspected 3 days later. Unsurprisingly, human flesh didn't knit back together neatly in that time frame. who could have predicted? And then there was the cold water trial. You'd be bound and thrown into a pond or river. Floating meant guilt. The water was rejecting your sinful self. Sinking meant innocence because apparently drowning was a mark of moral purity. The glaring flaw, even if you passed, you were still dead. Congratulations, these trials weren't for petty squabbles. Theft, heresy, witchcraft. All could land you in the let's see what happens games. Even better, the people supervising were often the ones who already suspected you, which made it like asking your executioner to check your parachute. Surviving didn't guarantee freedom either. Your neighbors might still believe you'd gotten supernatural help. That could earn you a stint in the pillory, or something far worse. On parchment, ordeal by trial was about divine justice. In practice, it was spectacle, intimidation, and a brilliant excuse to skip actual investigation. Why gather evidence when you can just burn someone's hand and call it God's verdict? If you were innocent, you prayed for divine intervention, or at least for a judge who preferred common sense over scalding water. If medieval towns had a centerpiece, it wasn't a fountain, it was the pillory. Picture it as the community notice board, except instead of paper notices, you posted yourself. The pillory was a solid wooden frame with holes for your head and hands. Once locked in, you stayed until the authorities decided your humiliation quota had been met. Enough usually meant after every person you've ever irritated has walked by to laugh at you. The crimes were varied: cheating at the market, fraud, insulting an official translation, telling the mayor his hat looked ridiculous. While immobilized, you were at the mercy of public creativity, rotten vegetables, mud, insults, the odd fish, and inevitably, pigeons. The crossbeam was perfect for perching, and pigeons were famously generous with their commentary. The goal wasn't to break bones, though bruises happened. It was to crush your reputation. You became a living exhibit. Parents would point you out to children, reciting your offense so loudly that even passers-by who hadn't heard the gossip got the full story. The real torture was time, hours or days with your neck bent, hands trapped, and the weather doing its worst left you aching and filthy. Bathroom breaks, forget it. Crowds often added flair, signs detailing your misdeeds, silly costumes from the punishment wardrobe, justice with a theatrical twist. By the 19th century, the pillory was fading, too cruel, and people enjoyed it too much. When the punishment becomes the town's favorite spectator sport, the moral line gets fuzzy. Still, for centuries it stood as a warning. In a small medieval town, your greatest fear wasn't prison. It was standing still while the whole community reviewed your life choices. Medieval Europe loved efficiency. Why have a punishment and a festival when you could merge them? Enter the whipping carousel, a public humiliation that doubled as entertainment. Imagine the condemned tied to a vertical post or strapped to a rotating platform. Instead of a quiet lashing, the whole spectacle played out in the square. The carousel wasn't decorative, it rotated slowly so everyone got an equal view. Think of it as a very sad rotisserie chicken. This served two purposes. No villager missed their turn to jeer, and the executioner didn't need to move much. The victim came to them, a rare workplace convenience in the Middle Ages. Crimes earning you a spin ranged from theft to blasphemy to losing the wrong political argument. The whipping hurt, but the humiliation was worse. Your neighbors didn't just hear about your crime. They watched your grimacing face spin by, lash after lash. The audience did its part, cheering, booing, occasionally tossing objects between rotations. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was spectacle. Bring the kids, Uncle Gerard's getting spun for cheating the miller. The length depended on the offense. Petty theft might get you a few turns. Bigger crimes could keep you spinning until your head swam and you questioned your life choices in slow, dizzy circles. Over time, devices like this vanished, replaced by less theatrical justice, though some towns surely missed the communal joy of watching shame rotate before their eyes. If there's one truth, it's that medieval shame wasn't private. It was public, rotating, and complete with audience participation. And then there was the wooden donkey, a bench-shaped torture tool for those who thought ordinary seating was too kind. Imagine straddling a char, sharp-edged beam for hours while weighted objects were tied to your legs, increasing the pressure. Painful, yes. Humiliating, absolutely. Add a crowd, and you had the perfect combination of suffering and spectacle. Medieval punishment was never just about correction. It was performance art, part morality play, part community entertainment. The devices were ingenious in their cruelty, designed to make the lesson unforgettable, not only for the guilty, but for anyone watching. The wooden donkey was not tragically an actual donkey, which is a shame, because if it had been, your odds of survival might have been higher, and at least you'd have an adorable set of ears to stare at while your dignity crumbled. Instead, it was a long, narrow beam of wood, topped with an edge so sharply angled it could double as a medieval letter opener. Calling it a seat was like calling a cactus a sofa. Offenders sentenced to this charming contraption had to straddle it like a horse, if the horse had been carved by someone with an intense personal vendetta against humanity. Legs dangled on either side, the beam pressing directly into places nature never intended to bear weight. But the fun didn't stop there. Authorities often hung heavy stones or iron weights from the victim's ankles, pulling their legs downward and driving that unforgiving edge further into tender flesh. It was as if the designers thought, what if sitting, but worse. Naturally, medieval towns rarely missed the chance to make punishment a spectator sport. This wasn't hidden away in some back alley. No, the wooden donkey was often planted right in the town square, front and center for every errand, drunning neighbor to gawk at. You didn't just suffer, you performed. The crimes that could earn you a ticket to this torture seat ranged from drunken brawls and public indecency to being a soldier caught misbehaving or a woman accused of loose morals, a charge conveniently vague enough to fit almost anything. The point wasn't purely physical agony, it was humiliation. The townsfolk came not just to see justice done, but to have a grand old time at your expense. People laughed, pointed, jeered, and occasionally brought their children to teach them a lesson. Proving medieval parenting manuals must have been written by stand-up comedians with a sadistic streak. If you so much as squirmed or yelped, the crowd's amusement doubled, the sentence length varied. A few hours on the donkey could leave you bruised for days. A longer stint could cause lasting injuries, and yet, in a twisted way, it was still considered a milder punishment compared to what else the era offered. Some towns even spruced things up, painting the donkey in bright colors or carving it with a head and tail, so it looked like some carnival ride from hell. In the end, the wooden donkey wasn't just about pain, it was about making you the headliner in the medieval variety show nobody wanted to star in. If the donkey was cruel, pona culle, penalty of the sack, in Latin, was downright theatrical in its horror. This grim little number had roots in ancient Rome, originally reserved for the crime of parricide, murdering your own father, mother, or other close kin. Some medieval towns kept the tradition alive because apparently no one sat down and said, "You know what? This might be a tad overboard." The process, if you can call it, that was simple and deranged. The condemned was sewn inside a large leather sack along with 4 unwilling coasts. Dars a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey. Yes, an entire disgruntled petting zoo crammed into one dark, airless bag with you. The symbolism was meant to sting: the dog for loyalty betrayed, the rooster for vigilance ignored, the snake for treachery, and the monkey. Well, historians are still guessing. Personally, I think someone in charge just really didn't like monkeys. Once everyone was inside and thoroughly panicked, the sack was hauled to a river or sea and tossed in. Drowning was the official method of execution, but realistically, the animal. Induced chaos inside the bag probably meant you'd already endured bites, scratches, and the snake's idea of personal space, long before the water hit your face. Not every town could get their hands on the exact animal. Caste list monkeys, for example, weren't exactly frolicking through medieval Europe, so substitutions happened. A goose for the rooster, a cat for the monkey, maybe a second dog if nobody had a snake handy. That meant 2 offenders guilty of the same crime in different cities could die in completely different ways. one in the sack of the original Roman lineup, the other trapped with an angry barnyard improv troupe. Pona Culé wasn't a common sight, but when it was carried out, it became legend. It punished the guilty, terrified the innocent, and likely scarred any onlookers for life. If there were awards for the strangest, most nightmarish execution methods in history, this one would walk away with the prize, assuming the monkey didn't steal it first. In the Grand Museum of Medieval Punishment Devices, the breaking wheel stands out for its deceptive simplicity. Picture a giant wagon wheel, the kind you might use to transport hay or barrels. Now strip away anything wholesome about that image and place the wheel upright in the town square. This wasn't a piece of farm equipment anymore, it was a stage for one of the grimmest performances a human could give. The condemned could be tied across the spokes or laid atop the wheel, arms and legs spread. Depending on the sentence, the punishment could range from mere public display, left for hours or days, while hunger, cold, and shame did the work, to brutal beating, designed to disable, read, permanently break the offender's body. Either way, the key element was visibility. You didn't just get punished, you got punished in front of everyone you'd ever met. Why a wheel? Part practicality, part drama. It was sturdy, portable, and easy to rotate so every side of you could be displayed to the crowd. A rotating criminal might even look like some strange human windmill, though without the renewable energy benefits. Parents had to explain to their kids why there was a man tied to a wagon wheel. He stole bread. Cue awkward silence at dinner. This was reserved for big deal crimes, rebellion, large-scale theft, violent acts that had rattled the community. The more serious the offense, the more elaborate the show. Some towns decorated the wheel, added banners, or posted written signs explaining the misdeed so that even those in the back row could appreciate the moral lesson. On rare occasions, the condemned was spun like a fairground ride from the underworld, part warning, part grotesque entertainment. Eventually, the breaking wheel went out of style not because medieval Europe suddenly developed a conscience, but because hauling out a massive wheel every time someone broke the law was logistically exhausting. Still, it left a cultural mark, proving that in those days, even everyday objects could be weaponized for maximum spectacle. While the pillory made you stand still for hours as people mocked you, whipping at the cart's tail was the opposite. It brought your shame directly to the people. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a public relations tour, except your press was a whip. The setup was straightforward. You were tied to the back of a cart, and the driver took you on a slow, humiliating parade through town, while an official whipped you. The pace varied, sometimes a leisurely walk, so the crowd could savor every moment, other times a brisk trot that left you stumbling to keep up. If the driver had a sense of humor or malice, they'd steer over every bump and pothole in the cobblestones for that extra jolt of misery. Your crimes didn't have to be spectacular to land you this gig. Petty theft, public disorder, insulting the wrong official, anything that annoyed the authorities enough to warrant public humiliation was fair game. Unlike stationary punishments, this one maximized exposure. A pillory could only shame you in one location. A whipping cart made sure your disgrace toured the entire neighborhood. The crowd was encouraged to participate, booing, throwing mud, or flinging vegetable scraps at you. Insults were common, some so creative they probably deserved literary awards. The punishment didn't end until the cart completed its route, often passing through the busiest streets multiple times to ensure no citizen missed the show. It was cheap, effective, and brutally efficient as a deterrent. No fancy equipment, no elaborate setup, just a cart, some rope, and a whip. In time, it disappeared as justice became less about public theater and more about behind closed doors verdicts. But for centuries, if you saw a cart rolling slowly through town with someone stumbling behind it, you knew the day's entertainment had arrived. And finally, in the fashion accessory department, nothing said, "I've made a huge mistake," quite like the iron collar. This wasn't an ornament you wore to impress, it was a thick, heavy ring of metal locked around your neck, often with a chain attaching you to a wall, post, or some other unglamorous fixture. Sometimes the chain was short, forcing you to stay in one place like the world's saddest garden statue. Other times it was long enough to let you shuffle a few steps, giving you just enough mobility to hope you could reach freedom's spoiler. You couldn't. Depending on the crime, you might be left there for hours, days, or longer with passers by free to point, jeer, or ignore you entirely, which could feel worse. The collar was above all else about marking you. No one could miss it, and no one could mistake its meaning. It was a portable, inescapable billboard announcing your guilt, and like so many punishments of the age, it thrived on public humiliation as much as physical discomfort. Medieval Europe didn't exactly believe in subtlety when it came to crime prevention. Justice wasn't something that happened behind closed doors. It was meant to be seen, felt, and remembered preferably by everyone within a 10-mile radius. The punishments were public, often humiliating, and sometimes so theatrical they could double as community entertainment. Let's explore a few of the greatest hits: portable shame, painful deterrence, permanent marks, and executions that doubled as full-scale productions. In some cases, there was no chain attached to the punishment at all. Instead, you were forced to walk around wearing a heavy, uncomfortable iron collar that served as a public announcement of your crime. It was not subtle in the slightest, deliberately obvious, weighing down your neck, and impossible to hide. Many collars were engraved with your offense: thief, liar, or my personal favorite, gossiper. Imagine trying to buy bread while wearing a sign around your neck that screams, "Don't trust me." Not exactly great for your customer service rating. This wasn't for capital crimes. The collar was reserved for the embarrass, don't execute category: petty theft, slander, cheating on market weights. Sometimes it was paired with other penalties, like being forced to stand in the town square for hours so everyone could read your shame and commit it to memory. The real genius of the iron collar was its longevity. It wasn't always just for an afternoon. Some offenders had to wear it for days or even weeks. Sleeping, eating, and simply existing became a miserable exercise in discomfort, and you couldn't take it off yourself. That required a blacksmith and the explicit permission of people who put it on you in the first place. In some towns, the collar was even fixed permanently to a wall or the side of a building. You'd be locked there until your time was up, a living billboard. Come for the market, stay to see the man who tried to cheat the baker. Eventually, the iron collar fell out of fashion. Attitudes toward public humiliation began to shift, and iron wasn't cheap spending it on neck. Wear for criminals stopped being worth the trouble. Still, in its time, it was an efficient little device. Portable shame, low maintenance, and guaranteed to make you the least popular guest at any medieval dinner party. If you stole something with your hand in medieval Europe, there was a very real chance you wouldn't be using that hand again. Amputation for theft was exactly what it sounds like: removing the offending body part. Sometimes it was just a finger. Sometimes the whole hand, and in particularly extreme cases, even a foot if your shoplifting skills were especially bad. The logic was straightforward: remove the tools of the crime, and the crime disappears. Brutal, absolutely. Effective, yes, mostly because it terrified everyone else into keeping their hands firmly in their own pockets. It wasn't applied to every stolen loaf of bread. In some towns, petty theft was punished with fines or public shaming, but repeat offenders or those caught stealing something valuable risked the one and done approach, and if the local lord wanted to make an example, the sentence might be carried out in the town square for maximum impact. Nothing drives home "don't steal" quite like watching someone's pickpocketing career end instantly. Methods varied. Some used an axe, others a sword, and in rare cases, a chisel and mallet, because why not add carpentry vibes to your legal system? The grisly work was often done by a specialist, both to ensure precision and to avoid having the local constable go home covered in blood after market day. The punishment carried social consequences as well as physical ones. In a society built on manual labor, losing a hand was more than an inconvenience. It could destroy your livelihood. It also branded you for life. Even if you claimed it was an accident with a millstone, no one was buying it. And while a skilled thief might have charm, stealth, and quick fingers, those talents don't go very far when you're down to one hand, and everyone in town knows why. Over time, European law grew less severe. Amputation was gradually replaced by imprisonment or exile, but for centuries it was a favored tool in the medieval justice system, decisive, irreversible, and impossible to ignore. If you couldn't be punished forever, your reputation could be. Branding was the medieval art of turning your skin into a permanent criminal record, no paperwork required. The process was simple in theory, if horrific in execution. A heated iron stamp was pressed into the skin, leaving a scar shaped like a letter or symbol announcing your crime: T for thief, F for forger, V for vagrant. In some places, they used little pictures instead of letters. Imagine walking into town with a tiny permanent icon on your forehead that basically says, "Ask me about my bad life choices." Branding wasn't always done on the face. Hands, shoulders, or other visible spots worked just as well. The point was visibility. This wasn't about quietly reforming someone, it was about turning them into a walking warning sign. The crimes that could earn you a brand ranged from petty theft to fraud, desertion, or breaking curfew in particularly strict towns. In some regions, it was a step in a ladder of punishment. A first offense might earn you a fine, the second a few hours in the stocks, and the third a shiny new mark on your skin. Branding wasn't just about shame. It was also practical for law enforcement. In a time before ID cards and mugshots, it was the easiest way to spot repeat offenders. Authorities could take one look at you and know your history, a painful early version of carrying your rap sheet in your wallet. The branding irons themselves varied. Some were small and almost delicate, as much as a searing piece of metal can be, while others were so large the mark could be seen across the market square. And because medieval justice loved a good public spectacle, branding often happened right in the town square with the whole community watching. Nothing warns people to stay out of trouble quite like seeing your neighbor's skin permanently engraved. Branding eventually fell out of favor as legal systems modernized, but its legacy lingered quite literally. In the Middle Ages, you could change your clothes, grow a beard, or move to a new town, but the mark stayed. In medieval justice, you didn't just serve your sentence, you wore it. If medieval punishments had a premium package, it was hanging and drawing reserved for the most serious crimes, usually treason. It was the legal equivalent of saying, "We're going to make absolutely sure you regret this." The hanging part is easy enough to picture, but here's the twist. It wasn't necessarily meant to kill you right away. Often, the rope was loosened before the end, ensuring you lived long enough for the rest of the punishment. Then came the drawing, which, despite the artistic name, had nothing to do with sketching. It referred to being hauled, often literally dragged, to the execution site. In some towns, the condemned was tied to a wooden hurdle or board and pulled by horses through the streets. If you think traffic jams are bad now, imagine trying to get to market with that procession blocking the road. Why so elaborate? Treason was seen as the ultimate betrayal, so the punishment had to send the loudest possible message: don't even think about it. And it worked, if not by inspiring loyalty, then at least by making the idea of enduring the punishment too exhausting to contemplate. It was a logistical production: horses, ropes, carts, and crowds all organized for a single person's downfall. The event drew pun intended huge audiences. People brought children, snacks, and plenty of gossip. It wasn't just about punishing the traitor, it was about reinforcing loyalty and giving the townsfolk a day off work. Over time, hanging and drawing lost some of its flair as punishments became quicker and less theatrical. But in its heyday, it was one of the most infamous shows in town. You didn't just get executed, you got an entire production. The message was unmistakable: betray your king, and your final day will come with an audience, a parade route, and more drama than a royal wedding. From iron collars to branding irons, from amputations to elaborate public executions, medieval Europe's justice system had one guiding principle: make the punishment so public, so humiliating, and so permanent that the thought of committing the crime again, or at all, would be unthinkable.